semester 6. As a continuation of the last video, I'll be discussing the basic features of post-colonial literature in this video. So with no further ado, let's dive into today's topic. The features of post-colonial literature can be summed up as the following: appropriation of colonial languages, metanarrative, rewriting history, deconstructing stereotypes and colonial discourse, colonialism and decolonization struggles, nationhood and nationalism. Now let me elaborate each of these for you one by one. The first feature is appropriation of colonial language. Appropriation generally refers to the strategies employed by the post-colonial societies and its writers and scholars that enable them to use philosophical, linguistic, and academic tools introduced by the colonizers to offer their own versions of truth and to dismantle the colonizers' claim to truth using the colonizers' own language and vocabularies. Thus, the aim is to decolonize the language of the colonizer. During colonization, colonizers usually impose their language onto the peoples they colonized. Therefore, when it comes to using of English for the purpose of creating literary works in the post-colonial space, two basic opinions can be found. One is writing back to the center with the language of the colonizer, that is English, and the other is using native languages and cultural vocabularies as a crucial strategy of developing a native cultural sphere that is free of the ideological determinisms of the colonial system of education and colonial ideological imperatives. This is thus both a strategy and also an effect. As an effect, I would like to point to what Shumona Bandyopadhyay writes in Indianization of English. She writes, "Because of social penetration and the extended range of functions of English in diverse sociolinguistic contexts, there are several varieties, localized registers, and genres for articulating local, social, cultural, and religious identities." In essence, thus, she is speaking about the various types of English and about the cultural penetrations into the language that we happen to encounter in our reading of post-colonial literature. This is also what Rushdie refers to as Chutnification. Say for instance, in the novel Midnight's Children, he puts into the mouth of Padma the words, "Eat, itna, food is spoiling." The use of the word na in the first sentence and the grammatical error, "food is spoiling" rather than "food is getting cold," carries with it the tempo and syntax of the vernacular. This is an example of abrogation. Now, what is this abrogation? Let me explain. Abrogation refers to the rejection by post-colonial writers of a normative concept of correct or standard English used by certain classes or groups and of the corresponding concepts of inferior dialects or marginal variants. So here when Padma is using a wrong English or grammatically incorrect English and fusing the word na into it, what she is doing is she is kind of abrogating or reversing the narrative. She is trying to reverse the narrative to her purpose, or what Rushdie is trying to do is Rushdie is trying to create a new kind of vocabulary out of the English of the colonizers. Now, this concept is usually employed in conjunction with the term appropriation, which describes the process of English adaptation itself and is an important component of the post-colonial assumption that all language use is a variant of one kind or another and is in that sense marginal to some illusory standard. Thus, abrogation is an important political stance, whether articulated or not, and even whether conscious or not, from which the actual appropriation of language can take place. More than just the language, abrogation also sometimes offers a partial or total negation of Eurocentric assumptions about culture, history, and truth. This is what Chinua Achebe means when he says that the language so used can bear the burden of another experience. And this has become one of the most famous declarations of the power of appropriation in post-colonial discourse. Thus, say for instance, in Achebe we see the use of Igbo proverbs into his use of English language, which was used to create the discourse of African as uncivilized to present the African culture. In Things Fall Apart, he writes, "Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten." This proverb fuses knowledge with life in Imofian society. Firstly, Igbo proverb as knowledge reverses the discourse that considers Africans as people who exist in opposition to culture and hence needed the civilizing mission. Moreover, palm oil rejects the European denotation for the cultural connotation that is derived of the Igbo society. It is essential for the reader to know that palm oil is a very important item in Imofian society and is used to cook and as a fuel source. And it also serves as a fuel source. And eating the words simply is a poetic way of saying to take them in or to gain knowledge. Thus, basically, this proverb means that proverbs are essentially words of wisdom, but this Achebe presents spiced with African culture and living, and by doing so strategically decolonizes the language. The second feature is metanarrative. Etymologically, meta in Greek means beyond, and narrative is a story. Thus, a metanarrative is the narrative account that experiments with or explores the idea of storytelling, often by drawing attention to its own artificiality. The colonizer's narrative went something like this. The Europeans were created to rule over other lesser people, from the Irish to the Igbo. Europeans were the designated masters, the rulers of the earth. Therefore, they were justified in ruling over others. That was their destiny. And anyway, they weren't really in it for their own profit. They were enlightening the darker peoples, the Africans, the Indians. They were civilizing them. Post-colonial writers have a big problem with this story, and so they started pointing out that actually there's more than one side to the story. In fact, there are often loads of different sides to the same story. A story that we take to be true or factual is often just one point of view among many. So in their own work, post-colonial writers tend to play around with metanarratives. That is, they draw attention to the way the stories or narratives are constructed, and especially how they are always told from a certain point of view or angle. Thus, either a counter discourse is presented, as for instance in Things Fall Apart, or say for instance in Meera Sayal's Anita and Me that you have already read, or we read a meta-narrative in the work, as for instance in Rushdie's Midnight's Children. In the novel, Salim Sinai puts himself right at the center of Indian history from the very first page of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which hence debunks the myth of one true history and also of narratives. This brings us to the third important feature of post-colonial literature, that is, rewriting of history. And this is a simple derivative out of the previously discussed points. European colonizers often thought that the people that they colonized didn't have a history before the Europeans enlightened them. The colonizers thought that the colonized peoples were people without history, so from that perspective, colonialism was a wonderful thing for them. So post-colonial writers, as an opposition to such a position, set about writing history from their own perspective, showing how colonialism was actually a pretty violent, terrible thing. Say for instance, Alex Haley's Roots traces the cultural history of an African, Kunta Kinte, brought to America as slave, and presents the validity and importance of oral narratives of familial and tribal history as an important element of Mandinka tribe. More importantly, these writers also show how history is a matter of perspective, and so Achebe, in narrating the story of transportation of slaves from Africa to America, shows the bitter and alternate history of colonization. The fourth feature is related to the preceding features that we discussed, where I spoke about metanarratives and history. Related to it is the concept of colonial discourse, which comes as a package with stereotyping. Colonial discourse is the collection of narratives, statements, and opinions that deals with colonized peoples, told from the perspective of European colonizers. These discourses aren't very kind to colonized peoples. It usually portrays them as savages, as uncivilized, as lazy, and as servants. Colonizers themselves are usually presented as civilized and benevolent and generous. This is what is denoted as stereotyping. In social psychology, a stereotype is an overgeneralized belief about a particular category of people. Colonial discourse and stereotyping was important in justifying the whole enterprise of colonialism, and so it became a very important theme for postcolonial writers. One of the goals of postcolonial writers is to attack this colonial discourse and stereotyping and point at its falsity. In Achebe's roots, as for instance, the narrative presents the rich cultural disciplining that the youngsters of Mandinka tribe had to go through in the village of Jufuru, which was thus a picture completely opposite to what Conrad presents in Heart of Darkness. Thus, glorification of postcolonial writers' cultural identity evolves through the postcolonial text. The fifth feature is the narrative of colonialism and decolonization struggles that we get to see in postcolonial literature. In fact, the effects of colonialism were so deep that even after independence, many countries and cultures continued to suffer from its effects. Even the post-colonial nations that emerged after independence were modeled along Western-style European nations with the same type of administrative and bureaucratic setup. As for instance, in the short story The Adivasi Will Not Dance, Sowvendra Sekhar Hansda, through the narrative of Mangal Murmu, presents the power dynamics where the indigenous Adivasi is stereotyped and marginalized. The narrator Mangal Murmu attempts a resistance by saying, "We Adivasis will not dance anymore on account of the exploitation identity crisis that they face, believing the president to be the best man in India. But he is beaten harshly." This narrative is an example of neocolonialism, but there are also many post-colonial texts dealing with colonialism. The decolonization struggles can be found in Lauren Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, where Benetha, the daughter of the Younger's family, wishes that her family members were not so interested in joining the white world. Benetha instead tries to find her identity by looking back to the past and to Africa. Postcolonial writers are really interested also in nationhood and nationalism. A lot of these writers are very patriotic. They write books on behalf of their nations. Their work is often nationalist because post-colonial writers like to highlight and valorize their nation's cultural, political, and social identity. As for instance, Ngugi wa Thiongo's novel A Grain of Wheat, through the central character who are members of the peasant community of Thabai Ridge, constructs national consciousness. Ngugi writes about the novel in his essay Moving the Center and says that the very choice of writing a novel in the 1960s that examined the lives of ordinary Kenyans was part of a wider struggle for the right to name the world for ourselves. Again, on the other hand, post-colonial literature isn't just about criticizing the colonial powers, it's also about criticizing the native corruption that betrayed the dreams of newly liberated nations. As for instance, Salman Rushdie shows us how dysfunctional Pakistani and post-colonial nationhood is in shame. So we are done with the features, and before I end, I would like to stress on one thing again, that postcolonial literature celebrates plurality and diversity, and so, while approaching the texts in your syllabus, do not come with any predetermined notion. Read and explore the world through the eyes of the postcolonial writer so as to enjoy the essence of the works. So, this brings us to the end of today's lecture. Hope you liked it. Thank you all for joining me.